Welcome everybody, and thank you for being here, and thank you for being here for this event today. I'm so happy about all of this happening, and it wouldn't be awesome if it wasn't for everyone in attendance, so thank you. So modular synthesizers, they're most of what's in that room. They are really intense as a thing to approach. They have a very steep learning curve. They're very expensive, and they can be really intimidating, but also, I think kind of flat out confusing, not even on a mechanical level, but to a lot of people who know something about them, like why? Seriously, just why? This thing is hard. There are much easier ways to make music. There are ways that have more direct sequencers. There are things that have lots of other advantages. Why? And to answer that question, I'm going to use the metaphor of a piano. So a piano has, there's certain components that you always expect inside of a piano. It's going to have some keys. Those keys are going to cause some hammers, which it has, to hit some strings which are inside of it, which are stretched across a big metal frame that's inside of it. It has a couple of pedals, which change the way that these things happen, how they're damped, etc. So you buy a piano, you get all of these things, and they're connected together in the way that a piano is connected together. But if we're to imagine a modular piano, then instead of these things all being one package, you buy them a la carte. You get your keys from somebody and you get your strings from somebody. And the first immediately desirable outcome of this is that you can put together the instrument you want piecemeal. You can say, well, I like the strings that these people make. I like the keys that these people make. And that's, that's the first layer of why you would want this thing. But more interestingly, once you get to doing that, you don't have to do the things with those pieces that are normally done in that context. You can set up your hammers to knock against the walls of your instrument. You could set up the hammer to hit your bandmate and keep them in the rhythm. But it's up to you what you're doing with them. And then in this hypothetical situation where there's a modular piano, if it gets popular and a bunch of weirdos start using it, all of a sudden you have people making things for it that would never be in a normal piano. You have a squirt gun that squirts water when it gets hit with a piano hammer. You have God knows what. You have strings getting made out of the strangest materials, and that's about where we are with Eurorack now. It started... Well, actually, it is the older form of synthesizers. This stuff predates integrated keyboard synths, but kind of forgetting that for a moment, because it's historically true, but in terms of the synthesizer culture, it all but died. It was a tiny cult before coming back recently. And in the recent emergence of Eurorack as the popular modular format has been a lot like that piano metaphor, where initially it was about having the standard parts of a synthesizer arranged in such a way that you can have them interact in a way that allows you to express a lot of creativity, not just with the music you're making, but creativity with your instrument itself, with how you assemble it, with how it interacts with itself. So that's kind of the why. So what's a modular synthesizer? What's going on here? I'm actually going to start at an unusual place. The actual guts of the system, the substance of what's going on, are the cables. Because in a modular synth, each of these modules is connected only right now by power. They are all powered on. But until you start patching it, they don't have any communication with each other, whatever. So you're patching them with cables. The cables all contain the same thing. They only contain one thing. They only contain voltage. I'm going to speak about voltage during this talk in a kind of simplified way that is useful for its applications in modular synthesizers. If you know things about electricity, just chill, man. So voltage is flowing through a cable. The voltage flowing through a cable is always measurable as a number, and it is always just one number. It's a function. It goes high, it goes low, it's never two things at once. Even a very complex sound wave that you hear coming out of a stereo that, listen to a song, it has many instruments in it, it has many things happening, that thing, that signal, before it comes to your speaker or as it goes through your speaker, is just one line of voltage going up and down quickly. So there's only ever one level. And if you froze that at any given point, you could measure the level that sound was at that moment. If you just, like freeze the playback and it's holding a thing, you could measure the voltage at that point. So there are a lot of connections being made within the modular, and they are all voltage. And I'm going to talk about the different categories of signals in the modular, but it's important to remember, and this is kind of like one of those things in math class where it seems like they're really, really over-explaining the basics in like kind of a back-asswards way, and you're like, why? But then as you actually get good at it, you're like, oh, I see, because I needed to do that for the advance. So I'm going to talk about several uses of voltage in modular, but it's important to remember that they're uses, they're applications. A given signal isn't just one thing. It's just voltage. It's voltage coming out of something. And if there's voltage, if I take the output of my CD player, you might say, well, that's audio, it goes in headphones or whatever. And it is, unless you use it for something else. You might plug it into some module here and it could have some effect on something, and then it's not audio. It's being used for something else, and it is defined by that usage, not by some inherent property that it has. Does that make sense? Somewhat? Let me talk about control voltage. So I'm going to talk a bunch in this talk about control voltage, about CV, and it's one of the things that makes modular special, control voltage. So what CV is, what it does. If you imagine that I had a jack in my chest. I had one of these 1/8" jacks, and I am a control voltage human. And when there's more voltage in this thing in my chest, my arms go up, and when there's less voltage, it goes down. And I give someone in the front row a box, and that box has a big knob on it, and it also has a jack. And when they turn that knob, electricity, voltage, comes out of that jack. When it's all the way down, it's 0. When it's all the way up, say it's 10. And if we attach that to me, and they have the knob all the way down, and they turn it up, my arms raise, and they turn it back down, and my arms go back down. It is as though they had a knob controlling me. But it's not that. It's different in an important way. They have a knob controlling voltage, which is controlling me. And that's useful because we don't just make simple voltage that you control by wiggling a knob up and down. We have all kinds of crazy tools for making different shape waves out of voltage, for making patterns out of voltage. And when you have the ability to control something, to control a parameter with voltage, combined with the ability to compose lines, that gets useful. You can do all kinds of interesting things. Everyone follow so far? Are there any questions about anything that I've said? Cool. So, control voltage. What uses does voltage have in a modular system? Number one is the easy one, is the expected one. Sound. Sound is voltage that is rising and falling very fast. You can make complicated sounds by making complicated voltage vibrations. The other kind of voltage in the system is CV, as I said, is control voltage, which is when you are using voltage not as sound but to control something. And there are several categories of CV. The first one is continuous CV, which generally people just call CV. And that's something where there are not like discrete states, like with my arms. It's not like we're going from there down to there up. There are many states in between. Small fluctuations make small differences. Big fluctuations make big differences. A lot of CV in the system is like this, and using voltage to wiggle knobs for you is kind of the core of what we're up to here. The second big category of CV is binary CV. Control voltage that is being interpreted by the thing that is receiving it in a binary way, as either a 1 or a 0. With many modules, the module is looking at, is it 0 volts or not 0 volts? Some of them are looking at, is the amount of voltage I'm receiving above or below some specific threshold? But in any case, binary CV is taking what may not be a square up and down input signal and interpreting it into a yes or no state. So that has a couple of subcategories within that. One kind of binary CV is a gate. A gate goes into an input, and when the amount of voltage in that input goes high, that thing gets turned on, or the state gets switched to the high state. And when it goes low again, the state gets switched to the low state again. So you could use this, anything in the system, any switch in the system, any button in the system that you wanted to press with voltage would be pressed with voltage with a gate. Any switch that was getting switched by a voltage in your system would be switched by that gate. The second big subcategory of binary CV control is clocks. And the differentiation here is kind of subtle because they're both binary CV and they're both used often in a rhythmic way, but clocks are the way that you distribute timing throughout your system. Often the one first module in a system that has no input and is putting something else out that branches outward and outward into what's going on will be somebody's clock source. The beginning of tempo decides everything else. There are many modules that multiply and divide timing, but that put out some sort of continuous tick to keep things moving along. And then the last kind of binary CV are triggers, which is when you tell something to happen. You can have some event of some length. Unlike the difference between a trigger and a gate is that with a gate, when it's up, it's on. When it goes back down, it's off. With a trigger, when the signal happens, something begins, and the duration of that event is defined by itself. It might be that you hit a drum, and the sound of that drum is going to happen in its entirety, and it doesn't care about what happens with the rest of that trigger signal. It could go back down or whatever. The event happens. It has been triggered. So that's it, actually, as far as control voltage goes. There are many complex applications of these things, and there are a huge number of different modules. But in terms of the fundamentals of communication within the system, that's all the kinds. There's audio, there's continuous CV, there's binary CV. There are some subcategories of those things. Does anyone have any questions about that? How are we feeling about this? Cool? Good? Having fun understanding so far? Okay. So we need modules to do things with this stuff. Now we have like a groundwork in what's going on here. So let's talk about the toolkit. There are a large range of different modules. They do different things. And your system can consist of whatever you want it to consist of, but there are certain standard things. There are certain modules that basically most people, unless they're working with a modular in some really idiosyncratic way, will have. The core one and the module that are the functionality that a lot of people think of when they think of a synthesizer, modular or otherwise, is the oscillator. An oscillator is, in many systems, in many configurations, the beginning of sound within the system. Which isn't to say it's the uninfluenced module. There are things controlling the oscillator, usually at least some kind of pitch change. But the oscillator is the first place within the flow where sound happens. And the oscillator puts out a tone. That tone is made out of cycles, as we talked about, several per second, several hundred per second. You get up to like 20,000 per second, you start 16,000 per second, you stop being able to hear it because it's so high. And there are analog and digital oscillators. I'm not going to go too far into that right now, but essentially an analog oscillator is the core of the sound, the beginning of the sound, the vibrating string of this system is a capacitor filling and emptying very quickly. It's a tiny battery charging and discharging. Or in a metaphorical sense, it's like a little bucket that fills to the top and then dumps. So that's the core of an analog oscillator, and it has some particular qualities. People debate whether analog is important, and I don't really have a strong stake in that. I think that there are many beautiful things to be done with many kinds of instruments, but the fact that it is based around a physical electronic component cycling and cycling and cycling very quickly introduces some really subtle imperfections, which even in a very, very well-engineered oscillator module are part of what gives an analog oscillator its flavor, as opposed to a more perfect digital sound. Analog or digital oscillator, they output a waveform. And now we're going to start making sounds with the synthesizer. So there are many kinds of waves. And first of all, so when I talk about a wave, right? You've seen them. You got something like this, right? If this were a graph, you have a sine wave. It looks like that. You've seen it before. What are the axes of this graph here? Yeah, what's the x-axis? Time. And what's the y-axis? Voltage. Thank you. It's amplitude, also true. Yeah, the amplitude is the height of this voltage. So that's why those are both sensible answers. But yeah, so we have waves coming out of our oscillator, which are voltage very quickly going up and down. And here's one of them. This is a sine wave. Now you may notice sine wave is very, very clean sounding. It's just one tone. It doesn't have overtones. It doesn't have harmonics. Whereas this pulse wave has a really big, rich sound full of harmonics. And this saw wave, somewhere kind of in between. You can hear some of the overtones, but not quite as many. Most oscillators have several waveform outs. Many of them have some kind of manipulations over those things, other capabilities, but essentially that's what it is. And you send it pitch information from something like a keyboard, and it is the beginning of a synthesizer sound. So I'm going to take the pitch control voltage out, if I can reach it. I'm going to take the pitch control voltage out from this key step, and I'm going to plug it into the 1 volt per octave input of this oscillator. Now 1 volt per octave is the standard for how pitch information is, communicated via voltage in a modular system. It wouldn't necessarily have to be 1 volt per octave, but that's the standard that has become the standard in Eurorack. So it's what we use. And basically anything that outputs pitch information as electricity, as voltage for modular purposes, unless it's something specially made for Korg equipment, will output volt per octave. Yeah, Korg is hertz per volt. I wish it was the same. I wish everything was the same. So this lovely sound, because this is really high. So, the beginning of a sound. I'll just let it drone, make these quieter. Much nicer. So, you can control the oscillator with something that outputs volt per octave, something that you could write melodies with. It could be a keyboard. It doesn't have to be a keyboard. It could be a module that you use to write melodies. It could be some kind of external sequencer that lets you write loops. But something can be used to control the oscillator if you have something with volt per octave out. You also don't even have to do that. I mean, if you don't want to control the oscillator in a way that is in a key, then you don't need a sequencer or something like that necessarily. You could, take something else in your system that puts out some kind of wave. And again, this is the creativity of modular. But yeah. So enough about oscillators. That's part number 1. The second super common part that you find, the super common module, super common function that you find in practically all modular systems is a filter. And in an electrical sense, a filter, at least a low-pass filter, is a slew limiter. It takes a wave that is moving up and down very quickly, and it limits its ability to move up and down quickly. And this is an oversimplification, but it's essentially true. And it's different for other flavors of filters. I'll talk about that in a second. But so if I have this filter, I turn these knobs like this, we have this input. You can hear this square wave input, and filters have a cutoff. The cutoff is the point at which the filter starts removing pitch information. It cuts things off. So a low-pass filter, the most common kind of filter that you find in synthesizers, modular or otherwise, is called a low-pass filter because it lets the lows pass. It's for removing high-frequency information. You set a cutoff, that cutoff has a slope, and as you move it, it removes the highs and leaves the lows. And the slope of the filter determines how much difference, whether it starts removing things and finishes removing them very quickly, or whether there's kind of a gradient being moved through the sound. So here's what a filter sounds like. You can hear how that's not just getting quieter. The sound changes significantly as the filter cutoff closes. Filters also have a thing called resonance. And what resonance is so you have a filter cutoff, and it's something like that, a low-pass filter. You're letting the lows through, you have a cutoff point which you can move, and from that cutoff point, it goes down, you're removing high-frequency stuff. What the resonance does is it makes the curve shaped more like this. It gives you a boost right at the point where the cutoff is, and you move that signal boost around in the frequencies. So it's the difference between this and this. Another thing that's really useful and interesting about that is that it brings out the harmonics of the sound as it moves through them. So listen for the extra notes as this filter goes down. Like plays a little scale there. With the fundamental as the root, and as you go through the harmonics, you get the third, the fifth. The next important piece of modular is a voltage-controlled amplifier. This one's actually really easy to explain. An amplifier does what? Makes things louder? Yeah, it amplifies. So in this case, it's not just louder, but loud at all. A voltage-controlled amplifier allows you to control the level of a sound with a voltage. And that's it, really. I mean, the level of not just a sound, the level of an electrical signal with a voltage. So the first way that that's practically usable is for sound. So now it's silent, even though they're plugged through the VCA. But if I plug into the middle, into the voltage control of this VCA, with something that just provides a straight voltage, I can now control the volume of this with this voltage that I'm providing it. But now I've just made a volume knob. That's not all that much fun. So I'll say something else about the VCA, and then I'll move on to the next thing. I'm not going to demonstrate this right now, but the VCAs are also extremely, extremely useful. In fact, one of the common sayings in the modular world is you can never have too many VCAs. This is advice that nobody takes because everyone is lazy about how they use their modular system. But if we were all more diligent, awesome users of modular, we would all have more VCAs. And it's because you can use a VCA to take one signal and multiply it by another. Or you can take the intersections of signals in order to generate more complex things. If you have a simple wave, and then you have a different wave which is out of time with that one, and you put one into the input of a VCA and one into the control voltage input of it, then you have that first wave getting turned up and down by the second wave. And the result is a much squigglier squiggle. You wiggle your wiggles and they get wigglier. And that's That's important. That's very useful. So VCAs are good for that. I'm not going to demonstrate that right now, but it's a really core sort of use of how you take how you complicate simple signals in order to get complex outcomes, which is a very important skill in general when patching a modular. So this is not my favorite way to turn this up and down. The whole idea of the system is that I shouldn't have to do the work, and I'm doing the work right now. You know, like turning a knob. Hate it. Want the machine to turn the knob. So the next module that I'm going to talk about in the core modular set is an envelope. An envelope is a module which generates a control voltage curve. It has a cycle. So you tell it to go, and it does its thing until it's done, and then it stops and waits for you to tell it to go again. And its thing, the thing an envelope does, is it rises and then it falls. It may rise very quickly, it may rise slowly, it may fall quickly or slowly, but one cycle of an envelope is rise and then fall. So I'm going to take this envelope module and use it to control that VCA. I'm going to get a trigger, get a long cable, and get a trigger from over here. One moment. Thank you for your patience. So now we have something. So envelope modules generally have 4 controls, most of them, and they are attack, decay, sustain, and release, ADSR. And I said it rises and then falls. These are 4 properties of how it rises and then falls. Attack is, I already drew on both sides of this. Attack is how fast it rises. And a shorter attack will rise more quickly. People often talk about envelopes being snappy. What they're talking about is how fast is the fastest rise that you can get out of this. People really push for fast envelopes. They want to be able to get that really quick rise from no sound up to sound, especially for crafting percussion sounds. This is extremely useful. So attack is the first one. A. The second is decay. And decay and the third one, sustain, are related. Sustain is, I'm skipping to decay for half of a second to talk about sustain because they are interrelated. Sustain is where is the level that it holds while the gate remains high. And decay is how long does it take to get there from attack. So, as I turn if I turn the sustain way up and the decay down, we have this basically like square wave sound. Release is how long it takes to let go at the end once the input is gone. Goes up with the attack, the decay falls, the sustain holds, and the release falls off at the end. An LFO is like that first oscillator that I talked about, but slower. It's a low-frequency oscillator. It generates a wave that rises and falls over time. And generally, the borderline between an LFO and an oscillator is whether it's going at a fast enough rate to be audible. So we've got this sound, and an LFO applied to this filter you can hear that slow wave bringing it up and down. That's what an LFO is. Many of them are voltage controlled, allowing you to change their rate with a voltage. All of them have some sort of rate control, whether it be a knob or whatever. It's also kind of a funny side note. Many of these things have voltage controlled in their names. A filter is a VCO, a voltage controlled, or an oscillator is a VCO, a voltage controlled oscillator. A filter is a VCF, a voltage controlled filter. the VCA controls the amplitude. It's all voltage controlled. We just like pointing it out a lot. Pretty much most modules are voltage controlled, or if they're not, they're very weird. But that's what an LFO is. It's one of the most simple things. Mixers are another important kind of module. If you make music in any form, you know what a mixer is. It mixes different signals together. The most common use of it is to mix audio together. But of course, in a modular system, voltage is voltage. You could mix anything together that you want. You could mix CV signals together. You could mix a CV signal together with audio to make a stranger signal to use as a CV somewhere else. Mixers are crucial. That's a common module. There are lots of clock, trigger, and gate modules that exist. There are various ways of writing rhythms with modules, and that's what those are for. Some of them allow you to write rhythms individually, send them in many places. Others are more centered around holding a central tempo and multiplying or dividing that so that you can be playing different speeds of things in different places. But they all have in common that they use some sort of control inputs to make rhythms, and they put out things that are square waves that go up and then down, and that allow you to control rhythmic things throughout your system. Another kind of module is CV processors, which are generally things that allow you to take CV and complicate it. VCAs are a simple CV processor in one kind of application. There are lots of others, and as you get deep into using a modular, you probably end up finding at least a couple that you like because you want to have some sort of intersection of signals in your system so that you're not just using like a simple LFO, because having a very regular rise and fall in a thing in your music is not very exciting if it's just that thing happening that way. But if you can take several relatively simple signals and make them more complex, that often has more musically desirable outcomes. The last large category, second to last large category of modules that I think are worth mentioning here are effects modules. And of course, this is a whole giant world unto itself. They all define what they do, completely by whatever kind of effect they want to have on sound. These are specifically for processing sound: delay modules, distortion modules, flangers and phasers and bit crushers, and anything that could take a sound and turn it into something else. And there's a giant world of those. And then sound voices are also an important kind of module. And these are a funny category because they actually often integrate many of these other parts that I just talked about into a single thing. But they're very popular for good reason, because the convenience of a put together instrument that does one thing is nice in those. We've decided to kind of forego that in using a modular synthesizer, but sometimes it's nice to have something that provides a complete sound unto itself without any other kind of patching or interaction within your system. You could write a part with this thing. You could have an element in your song that is that. Some examples of that would be percussion modules, or like any percussion module. You take like a bass drum. There's not one single, simple electronic circuit making that bass drum sound. There's an oscillator, there's a VCA, there's an envelope. This is all probably sounding pretty familiar. It's all of that stuff condensed into a small space and dialed in for a specific purpose. There are also single voice modules that you can get if most of what I just said is not the way that you want to go about using this instrument. If you're like, oh, well, the compositional possibilities here are very interesting to me, but I don't really want to muck about with the raw mechanics of soundcraft in here. I want to play with this other aspect of modular that's interesting to me, but that timbral stuff, I can get what I want without working that hard. There are lots of voice modules that allow you to do that, where you can just pick up one whole voice to do something with. And I keep saying that it's the last module because I keep realizing that I left things off of my list. And the last type of module that I'm going to talk about, and I've mentioned them a couple of times, is pitch sequencers. There are many, many ways to determine pitches that you're sending to your oscillators. There are some where you can compose completely by hand, write a thing that you want, save it in there, recall it for your show, be organized about it. There are some where you can introduce all kinds of chaos into the system. There are some where you don't actually save a sequence inside of it and it's entirely crafted around sending voltage into it, the interactions of which generate a sequence that goes to your oscillator. There are things that are all kinds of intersections between all of those things I just said. So I've talked about all these kinds of modules, and I've put together a thing right here, and I'm gonna pull this, I'm gonna put it over here to this gate, and what I actually have here in terms of a configuration has a name, and this name is an East Coast voice. This is called an East Coast voice because Moog synthesizers are on the East Coast, and it is the most common way for modules to be assembled into a musical voice. It's certainly not the only way, but it is the way that these things are put together inside almost any commercial synthesizer that you buy. You get an analog synth off the shelf. The way that it's configured is that an oscillator goes into a filter, goes into a VCA, an envelope goes into that VCA. That envelope is triggered by a keyboard, and the output of that VCA goes to the output of the synth. Now, the reason that we want to have an envelope in there triggered by the keyboard, this is good, nice and low, is because if you just have the keyboard controlling the VCA, the envelope, it's only on when you're holding it down and it's off when you release it. The envelope allows us to have this nice sound shape to it. And this is a popular kind of envelope, the quick rise, slow fall, because this is how sounds work in nature, in real life. Most sounds have a quick attack and some amount of release after that. The sound of a piano, you hit a key, it very quickly goes high, it more slowly gets quieter. The more, resonant properties the material you're hitting has, the longer the envelope of the sound that it makes when you whack it with something. So that's why an envelope into a VCA, and that's an arrangement of a voice. There are also ways to use CV within an East Coast voice that are still standard, that are still East Coast, using an LFO to move the cutoff of an envelope around, or the cutoff of a filter around. All these words are starting to run together for me. I'm so sorry. Using an LFO to move the cutoff of a filter around is one very common thing. There are others. But once you start to get really creative with how you're making your modules interact with each other, you're no longer in East Coast territory. And one of the funny things about the modular world is that there's East Coast, West Coast divide of synthesis, but it's a funny divide because East Coast is doing things one pretty particular way, which many, many, many people do, and West Coast is whatever else you want to do, being crazy. So, map that onto the country how you will. But West Coast synthesis has a lot of appeal for people who are interested in a modular system, not as a customizable, to return to the original piano metaphor. East Coast people are generally more I'm going to replace the pieces of my piano, I'm going to add some more functionality that lets me control it in a complex or interesting way. West Coast people are, the hammer will hit the ball, which will roll down the thing. They're using an oscillator to control an oscillator to make some kind of crazy, like, so I have 2 oscillators in this system, right? So if we have the output of this filter, this is our nice pure oscillator tone. If I take this other oscillator and I plug it in here, right away we have something totally insane. And this is just one oscillator oscillating another one, but it is moving the frequency of the second oscillator up and down at an audio rate. It's moving a moving wave hundreds of times per second up and down. And then if we start messing with the with this other oscillator in some way, I don't know. I mean, it's a mess. I'm not a West Coast synthesist. I'm boring, you guys. I have a normal patch. No, my personal style is more about using the relatively conventional core sonic setup and then being interesting with my CV, trying to kind of ride the line of semi-conventional musicality. I'm not very good at exploring the really bizarre timbers of Modular because it's just not my territory. Although if you go to our Modular on the Spot show from 6 to 8:30 at Museum of Human Achievement, you'll see a whole bunch of people who are amazing at that. You can have anything in here. I talked about a whole bunch of categories of modules, and as you can see on my list of like a dozen on here, I still left off important ones that I remembered while I was standing here talking. And there are more. There are, as you probably saw in there's a whole world of video synthesis where you can use this same kind of tool set, this same set of interactions to control video instead of audio. There are modules that allow you to use voltage and triggers to control physical and mechanical interactions of things. To actually, I said hit your bandmate. I'm pretty sure you could do that. I think if somebody in here puts their mind to it. There is how does the Pittsburgh video game system work? Anybody know? There's a video game module which I believe outputs control information based on what you're doing in the video game. I don't even know. People make the strangest things, and people can make anything because to come back around, it's all voltage. You can put whatever you want in your module that you make if you're a creator for this format, and as long as what it takes in is voltage and what it puts out is voltage, and it's in a reasonable, it's within the constraints of the format, it doesn't go above 10 volts or below negative 10 volts, inside it could be whatever you want. And so it's an exciting format at this moment because it's exploding and because lots of people are having lots of interesting new ideas about how do you manipulate voltage in this? How do you interpret that voltage information into sound? How can you be creative about the kinds of manipulations that you can do, either to control information or to the sound resulting from that control information? And that's pretty much it. That's the how and the why. You have a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious. Can you talk about whether there are modules that have input methods other than knobs?
There are tons of kinds of input methods other than knobs. That's a
ribbon
yeah. There's all kinds of control. Whatever you want to be the way you control your modular, you could make that happen. There are touch ribbons that are in modules or that attach to the modular. Mickey in the other room has a module that allows you to use a Wiimote to output control voltage, and you can move your hands around in the air and make CV that way. There are various keyboards and touch controllers and sequencers and things which can be used externally.
Light controllers.
Hmm?
Light controllers.
There are light controllers. Yeah, I don't even know. There's so many. I'm sure that there are like really cool ones that I'm not thinking about right now. But yeah, that Coma.
The heart rate. One.
Oh, that's
true. That Colin guy did.
Mm-hmm.
His room flash with his heart rate.
And now that you mention that, I have seen mind reading modules actually on YouTube.
Okay.
People make them, and they like I don't know what.
I'm doing really badly at this.
I don't know what the actual reading is, but it's something that like goes on your head, and in some respect measures the electricity in your brain or something. Takes some sort of information that it's getting from scanning your head and uses it to generate voltage that you can control a modular with. So yeah. Anything. I bet somewhere someone has set up a treadmill to control a modular.
There's that guy that did a bike.
Yeah.
That's also true. Look, Mom, No Computer did a bike.
What are some examples of some modules that are CV processors?
One that I make is called the Bends,
Okay.
and is a voltage-controlled averaging matrix. It lets you use voltages to average other voltages with each other. There is also the 4MS VCA matrix is another way that you can kind of take these complex multi-VCA intersections of signals. They're
Just an inverter.
That's true, yeah.
Take a positive voltage, turn it negative.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there are many modules that combine inversion with other kinds of manipulation that you can do as well. Also, a good vocab word with regard to voltage manipulation is an attenuator. In a modular system, an attenuator is something that allows you to turn a signal down. And that may seem like a pretty simple thing to want several of in your system, but it's often very useful because you'll get some sort of control wave coming out of something and it's really tall, and you put it into the thing that you want it to control, and you have your filter going wow, wow, and you just want, kind of that subtle thing. So you use an attenuator, you turn it way down into the little wave that you want, you use it to control the other thing. You had a question?
Sorry. No, I was just gonna piggyback off the controlled voltage is I seen somebody do tap dancing, controlling the whole modular.
Yes.
Oh, and microphoning.
Oh,
It's
that's
a super basic first entry level DIY thing, and it's a contact mic.
Mhm. Yeah.
Pitch to voltage converters. So any microphone, any musical instrument or sound, you can turn into voltage.
I've always found those really kludgy. Have you found a good one?
Yeah, that's why guitar synthesizers don't work.
Yeah.
It's hard to track.
It's really hard to do that well, yeah. But yeah, the microphoning is really cool because you can you just tap a panel, you tap your actual modular to send information. I actually saw Daedalus do an amazing set on a modular. He didn't even have any oscillators. He just had a sampler module with a bunch of songs on it that he was remixing, and he would switch, he'd do his fancy fade into a new song, and then he'd just literally just kind of slapping his modular like he's just tapping his hand along the song, except that it's actually getting everything in sync with what's going on, but also just kind of looks like he's a zany guy, tapping on his instrument, having a good time, which is great.
Somebody's got that spring module.
Oh yeah,
Everybody
yeah.
thinks it's reverb, but it's actually a noisemaker where you hit the springs.
Mm-hmm. And it outputs an envelope as well. Yeah, another weird input method, a spring that you hit, and you get multiple different kinds of useful signals out of it. Audio possibly, and a voltage envelope. Oh yeah. Other questions? Okay. Well,
Somebody made a door stopper module.
I think that's happened. Yeah. Are you saying they did do
I
that?
think that's Magpie.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Of course. Yes.
Are there any standard transformations that is there a library of standard ways that people make sounds and then name them, or is it just everybody just doing whatever they want?
I'd say mostly everybody doing whatever they want, but there are a number of modular cookbooks that you can find online, especially on the unfortunately named Muffwiggler forum.
I've crossed out so many times.
What's that?
What is this Muffwiggler?
So that's true also. That Patch and Tweak book is wonderful. Muffwiggler is a giant forum that contains a million wonderful pieces of information about synthesizers, modular synths, how to build them, how to use them. Lots of people who have put together these big guides about interesting ways to patch them and their results. There are patches that have names that are, you know, a particular way of setting things up. A Krell patch, for example, is one famous way of creating like semi-random kind of generative music, and it's a whole setup involving you need to have not necessarily specific modules, but modules that accomplish a whole bunch of different specific purposes in order to do it. And it's really a great place, and unfortunately the founder of it just passed away. He was a great builder of our community. But I do hope that, you know, at some point in the future, the center of modular world on the internet is not called Muffwiggler.
Does your color of patch cable mean anything?
For many people, it's useful to have like one color of patch cables per kind of signal. They'll do like one color for clocks and another for audio. And I object to that because that's not true. The clock is all voltage. But I like, no, not for me. I like the random rainbow because it makes it easy to visually trace. If I have a bunch of blue cables all doing the clock thing, it's a little bit harder to look here and be like, oh, in my giant spider web of cables, I can visually trace this one over to there. Whereas if they are just a completely random assortment, then it's relatively easy to visually trace them.
What's your favorite module that you didn't build?
Kemi's Castle. It's a...
Spencer.
Yeah.
Wants one so bad.
It's really good. It's a very expensive dual FM oscillator. It's giant. It makes all kinds of really interesting timbres, and you can manipulate it in these fun ways. It's also built around the same sound generation chip that was in the Sound Blaster sound card that was the defining sound of all the video games I spent my childhood playing, because I was like a PC kid more than a console kid. So it's like, you know, it's like my NES sound, except, you know, that it's way better than the sound of the Nintendo. Just trolling. I also really love the All Right Devices Chronoblob 2 that relatively recently came out. It's a dual delay, and it has separate clocking for each half of the delay. So you can feed it your tempo, but then separately multiply and divide that tempo for each of the two channels, so that you can have these delays that match the tempo of your song, but that aren't at the same tempo as each other, by multiplications and divisions. And that thing is just absurdly, easily, immediately musical. Both of them are. And that's what I like about them. There are a lot of complex oscillators that are really good for West Coast experimentation and timbral exploration, but a lot of them, as soon as you start manipulating their more interesting parameters, aren't in tune. And I really love when things are in tune. It's great. I'm really, the Western tonality, I dig it, unashamed. And so something I really like about the Kemi's Castle, and the Chronoblob actually, but like it's more common in a delay, is that you can manipulate, actually no, it's not more common in a delay, because the Chronoblob has a thing where you can change the time without pitch bending. They both allow you to manipulate a lot of interesting parameters while staying in tonal pitch space. And it's relatively rare to be able to make these big manipulations on an oscillator that really change the way it sounds dramatically and don't change the fundamental frequency. So yeah, I love that about it.